Peppa Pig, the twin brother. One evening, Peppa Pig's family was expecting a guest. Daddy Pig's twin brother, Gilbert, was coming to visit for the first time in many years. Daddy Pig often talked about how inseparable they were as children, but Gilbert had moved far away, and they had barely seen each other since. That evening, the doorbell rang. Standing on the doorstep was Gilbert. He looked exactly like Daddy Pig, but something about him was off. His smile was too forced, and his eyes seemed empty. During dinner, he barely spoke, silently observing everyone. His movements were unnatural, as if he was learning how to use utensils for the first time. George hid behind his chair the whole time, and Peppa felt uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. That night, Peppa woke up to a strange creaking sound. In the hallway, in front of the mirror, stood Gilbert. He wasn't just looking at his reflection. His reflection was moving with a slight delay, as if struggling to mimic his movements. At one point, he suddenly turned towards Peppa. In the morning, Mummy Pig seemed worried. Daddy Pig was gone. Gilbert was still in the house, acting as if he had always been there. His voice was muffled at first, but as the hours passed, it started to sound more and more like Daddy Pig's. Throughout the day, he imitated Daddy Pig's habits. He sat with a newspaper, tried to joke, but his laughter was hollow. As evening fell, a muffled voice was heard outside. It sounded like Daddy Pig. He was calling for help. Peppa rushed to the door, but Gilbert was already there. He looked at her and slowly smiled. At that moment it became clear. Daddy Pig wasn't coming back. Gilbert had already taken his place. Peppa Pig. George disappeared. George always loved playing in the yard. Every day he ran around the garden with his favorite dinosaur, imagining new adventures. Everything was as usual. Peppa was drawing in her room, Mummy Pig was making lunch, and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Through the window, George could be seen running near the big tree. His joyful laughter echoed through the yard. But suddenly, everything fell silent. In the sudden quiet, Peppa looked up. At first, nothing seemed unusual, but then she realized George was no longer in sight. The backyard door was slightly open. On the grass lay his toy dinosaur, abandoned in an unnatural position, as if George had simply dropped it. Peppa stepped outside, but the garden was empty. No movement, no sounds, only a gentle breeze. Mummy Pig called for George, but there was no response. Daddy Pig joined the search. They checked behind the bushes, walked around the house, and inspected the fence. But there was no sign of where George could have gone. Half an hour passed. Peppa picked up the dinosaur and noticed strange marks on its plastic back. Narrow, elongated prints that definitely didn't belong to George. The unease grew. They searched the entire yard, the neighboring areas, but it was all in vain. Then Peppa heard a faint sound, a quiet giggle, barely noticeable, coming from behind the bushes. She froze, then slowly walked in that direction. Behind the bushes, no one was there, but the grass was pressed down, as if someone had just been sitting there. The sun slowly dipped below the horizon. The house sank into an eerie silence. The door remained open. On the table, the dinosaur lay still, now cold and forgotten. When darkness fell, Peppa heard the giggle again, this time right by the door. This episode of the animated series, Peppa Pig, has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside, but something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig. This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, Voices on the Second Floor. It was a late evening in the Pig family's house. The wind howled outside, rushing through the dark streets. Rain drummed against the roof, trickling down the windows in thin streams. Everything seemed like a normal rainy night, yet something in the air felt wrong. Peppa and George sat in the living room, wrapped in warm blankets. The television flickered with a silly program, but neither of them could focus on the screen. The house was too quiet. Even the sound of the rain felt muted, as if the walls had thickened. Then they heard it. Voices. They came from upstairs. It sounded like someone was walking on the second floor and talking. But they both knew that Mummy and Daddy Pig had already gone to bed. Their door was closed. There was no one else in the house. Peppa froze. George clutched his dinosaur. The voices were muffled but clear. The words were indistinct, yet it was obvious that someone was speaking. A whisper, a quiet laugh, slow footsteps, the floor creaking under the weight. Peppa lifted her head, staring at the staircase. The second floor was swallowed by darkness. The stairs seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the top step was sinking into a void. The voices didn't stop. They sounded wrong, like someone was pretending to sound familiar, but was failing. The voices grew closer. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. And then they began to descend. Step, pause, step, pause. Something was coming down. Peppa and George didn't move. Their hearts pounded so loudly that it felt like the whole house could hear them. But the worst was yet to come. When it reached the middle of the staircase, the upstairs light flickered. For a brief moment, they saw a shadow, tall, stretched, and completely still. The footsteps continued. The voices were right there. Peppa couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed George's hoof and squeezed her eyes shut. And suddenly, everything stopped. No more footsteps, no more voices, only silence. Peppa slowly opened her eyes. The top of the stairs was empty, but she knew that something was still there. It just didn't want to be seen.